Now, in addition to the internal sources of conflict, which I've mentioned, there are obviously the important effect of external actors, and in particular of Iraq's near neighbors. And there, our report assessed that the only neighbor that was likely to intervene overtly was Turkey. That Turkey is the only neighbor that would, under conceivable circumstances, and actually quite conceivable circumstances, actually invade Iraq. It's done so periodically over the last several years, and it could do so again with much higher levels if provoked under certain conditions. And indeed, this could easily be one of the consequences of a deterioration in Arab-Kurdish relations. The countries that are likely to intervene covertly would be Syria and Saudi Arabia on behalf of the Sunnis, and Iran on behalf of the Shia, and indeed potentially Iran on behalf of some Shia as opposed to others, although by and large Iran has hedged its bet and provided support to all of the Shia factions. Again, we don't assess any of these interventions as likely, at least at high levels, unless a deterioration of relationships among the main Iraqi actors that are in the political system at the moment were to break down, offering opportunities and provoking that kind of external intervention. So what are the conclusions for American policy? First of all, we assess that the current schedule for withdrawals, which has us removing all so-called combat troops by next summer, but redefining a number of combat troops as non-combat troops in the process. So although the U.S. will withdraw a significant component of its current capabilities between the elections in ideally January and the summer, they will leave behind a number of what are called advise and assist brigades, which retain very substantial combat capabilities, although combat is not their principal mission. Their principal mission is to partner, train, and mentor Iraqi units. That the schedule under is feasible, provided the conditions that I've set out, that is, no major falling out among the main parties in the Iraqi political system develops. Secondly, that the U.S. should withdraw last from the areas that are most volatile and are most likely to become flashpoints, which include in particular the contested areas between Kurdish and Arab Iraq, like Kirkuk and other areas along that divide. That should be the last area from which U.S. troops should leave. And finally, that the U.S. needs to begin to give serious consideration to what kind of role it intends to play in Iraq and what kind of relations it wants with Iraq after 2011. The process of training and equipping and supporting Iraq's own security forces has progressed considerably over the last several years. And in many respects, these forces are increasingly capable of standing on their own and should be by the end of 2011. But there are some things that they're not going to be ready to do, including defending Iraqi airspace and assuring Iraqi sovereignty over its airspace. That's something they're not going to be able to do by the end of 2011. And there are other more limited areas where some further sort of external assistance is likely to be necessary. And one of those areas is to continue to monitor and mediate along the Arab-Kurdish divide. We don't believe, we Rend, don't believe those issues will be settled by 2011. And at the moment, the U.S. is playing an important role by being in communication with both sides, by mediating individual disputes, which could escalate if they were not controlled. And while you don't necessarily need a large armed force to continue to provide that, there probably does need to be some sort of external monitor and facilitator to play that role after 2011. Clearly, the U.S. needs to look at its post-2011 role in Iraq in a broader regional context. What sort of long-term role does it envision for itself in the Gulf, in the Middle East? And my personal view there is that we ought to be, over time, looking toward a return to the equilibrium that existed from the British withdrawal in the 1950s until the American entry in 1991. That is, you had a prolonged period during which there were no Western forces in the Gulf. You had visits, you had over-the-horizon presence, you had small facilities where ships could come in and refuel, but you had no ground forces and in fact, no air forces throughout the region, and the region remained stable. And it's worth remembering, as we tend to be very concerned about Iran and the rise of Iranian power, that it wasn't Iran that precipitated the American engagement in this region. It was Iraq. It was Iraq that brought us in the first time, first Gulf War. It was Iraq that kept us there after the first Gulf War. And it was Iraq that brought us in even more heavily since. And so you can conceive of an equilibrium in that region which doesn't require a major Western military presence. And I believe in the long term that ought to be our objective. I also don't believe it's an objective that can be reached early. I think that it requires a good deal of time and a changed relationship with Iran, among others, before it becomes feasible. But I do believe that it ought to be the declared U.S. long-term objective. Thank you.
Let me ask you again. We're going to put our speakers up on the podium so you in the back can see them.